At 57, the tragedy of Keith Urban is beyond heartbreaking. He was the golden flame of country music, the man whose guitar turned pain into poetry and silence into sound. To millions, Keith Urban was unstoppable. The perfect smile, the stadiums roaring, the love story with Nicole Kidman that felt like destiny itself. But behind the thunder of applause, there was another rhythm, darker, quieter, and far more human. A rhythm born from fire, fear, and a boy who learned too early that music can save you, but it can also haunt you. He rose from the ashes of a burned-down childhood home, from a father who loved and hurt in the same breath, from nights when his only friend was the hum of his guitar. Every success he ever achieved was built on pain. No one saw a pain that followed him into fame. They called him a legend. But legends are often broken before they shine. And the same fire that made Keith Urban a star almost destroyed him. Because behind every melody that made you fall in love, there's a scream the world never heard. And Keith Urban's scream still echoes raw, quiet, and eternal. He didn't come from fame. He came from fog, from a small New Zealand town where dreams were too fragile to speak out loud. Keith Lionel Urban was born into motion, a life that never stood still. His family moved constantly, chasing work, chasing peace, chasing something that always seemed just out of reach. But even then, the boy had music in his bones. He would sit by the window for hours, strumming a ukulele with hands too small for its strings, eyes filled with something both wild and wounded. There was a hunger in him not just to play, but to escape. When the family finally settled in Australia, they thought the storms were over. They weren't. One night, the fire came. A blaze so sudden it devoured everything they owned, the walls, the photos, the small certainties of childhood. Keith stood in the street watching his home collapse into smoke, holding his mother's trembling hand. That image of fire taking everything never left him. It would later shape every song he ever wrote. His father, Robert Urban, was a man split in two, devoted and destructive. He loved country music as deeply as he feared his own failures. He'd play records of Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings late into the night, his voice soft when he sang, sharp when he drank. Keith adored him and feared him in equal measure. In one interview years later, he whispered, "My father taught me music and pain." That contradiction became the blueprint of his life. The stage would one day give him applause, but the silence of those nights gave him soul. He learned that every melody hides a bruise, and every song worth singing must come from something broken. By the time he was a teenager, Keith wasn't chasing fame, he was running from ghosts. He played in bars where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and regret, too young to be there, too old to turn back. Music became his refuge, but also his addiction, the only thing that made him feel alive, and the only thing that could destroy him if he let it. This was the beginning of the myth, a young man forged in fire, molded by fear, chasing redemption through sound. But the boy who played to survive was about to face the hardest truth of all. No matter how far you run, some fires follow. The fire never really left him. It lived quietly beneath his skin, a memory disguised as rhythm, a wound that hummed in every chord he played. Even as the smoke faded from that night, the fear remained, the fear of losing everything again. His father's love for music became both a gift and a curse. Robert Urban, with whiskey on his breath and country songs in his veins, wanted his son to live the dream he could never reach. He taught Keith to play the guitar not with patience, but with demand. "If you're going to do this," he'd say, "you do it right." And so, the boy learned not just notes and chords, but how to play through pain, how to smile through the noise. There were nights when the house was loud with shouting, and mornings when the silence felt heavier than the walls themselves. But the guitar became his armor, each string a shield, each melody a small act of rebellion. When he couldn't speak, he played. When he couldn't cry, he sang. At only 8 years old, Keith was already performing in local pubs, tiny, smoky rooms where the laughter of strangers drowned out his fear. He stood on a stage too tall for his small frame, eyes closed, fingers trembling, playing for people who barely looked up from their drinks. Yet, in those moments, he found something close to belonging. The stage became the only place where he could breathe without being afraid. His first mentor, Sue McCarthy, once said, "Keith didn't just play the guitar, he talked through it. She saw what others missed, a child trying to turn chaos into beauty." Under her guidance, he began to win small competitions, small applause, small proofs that maybe, just maybe, Music could be more than survival. But behind each performance was a secret kind of exhaustion, the kind that only comes from pretending to be fine. The world saw a prodigy. His parents saw a chance at redemption. Only Keith saw the truth that his talent was born from pain, not joy. As he grew older, the applause grew louder. The crowds got bigger, but inside, nothing changed. He was still that boy staring at a burning house, still trying to make sense of what had been taken. The difference was that now, the flames were invisible. They burned in his chest instead of his home. And though no one knew it yet, that same invisible fire would one day drive him to the edge of fame, of addiction, of himself. He was still a boy when he began chasing a dream far too big for the world around him. Australia had given him his first applause, but also its first ceiling. Country music wasn't supposed to belong to an Australian kid with blonde hair and an accent the Nashville crowd didn't understand. But Keith Urban was never built to fit in. He was built to break through. He played wherever he could, bars, small festivals, state fairs. His mother sewed his stage clothes. His father loaded the van. Every show was a gamble between hope and heartbreak. The applause felt good, but the emptiness afterward felt worse. He was chasing something he couldn't name, a sound, a feeling, maybe a place where he could finally rest. When his first album failed to make waves, the industry shrugged. But Keith didn't. He packed his guitar, sold what little he owned, and left for Nashville alone, terrified and utterly determined. He would later say, "I didn't move to America to try. I moved to succeed or die trying." Nashville didn't welcome him. It tested him. Doors slammed. Calls went unanswered. Labels smiled politely, then disappeared. For a while, he played background guitar for other singers, hiding in their shadows, learning what it meant to be invisible in a city built on dreams. He wrote songs that others sang, watched them climb charts he couldn't touch, and wondered if his own voice would ever matter. Some nights, he'd walk through the streets after gigs, his hands aching, his chest hollow, whispering to himself that it wasn't over. Other nights, he wasn't sure he believed it. Addiction lurked quietly, disguised as comfort. Loneliness became his constant companion, that same invisible fire, only colder now. But pain has a strange way of refining purpose. Out of that silence, he built something raw and true, a sound that mixed country soul with rock's rebellion. He didn't know it yet, but he was crafting what would one day make him unforgettable. Then came the moment everything changed, a song that carried both his faith and his fear, but for the grace of God. It climbed the charts like a prayer finally answered. For the first time, the world stopped to listen. The boy from a burned-down house, the man from nowhere, had finally found his way into the heart of country music. But with fame came something far more dangerous: visibility. And when the lights found him, they also found his shadows. Fame didn't arrive softly. It crashed into Keith Urban's life like thunder after a long storm. The boy who once played in smoke-filled bars now stood beneath golden lights, his name echoing across sold-out arenas. His music, wild, sincere, untamed, redefined what country could sound like. He wasn't just another singer. He was the bridge between Nashville and the world. Crowds screamed his lyrics back at him. Critics called him a virtuoso, a revolution wrapped in denim and heartache. Awards poured in: Grammys, CMAs, AMAs, each one another reminder that he had finally become everything he once dreamed of. He'd walk on stage and feel a wave of energy so intense it was almost holy. And yet, when the music stopped, silence followed him home. Success had a shadow. The more he climbed, the smaller the world around him became. There were endless tours, interviews, cameras, flashing lights. Everyone wanted a piece of him, but no one really saw him. The applause that once healed now began to hollow. He could stand before thousands and still feel unseen. He poured that ache into every song. Tracks like "Somebody Like You" and "Days Go By" were more than hits. They were confessions disguised as anthems. He sang of love, redemption, and the ache of time slipping away. The world called them uplifting. Keith knew they were cries for balance, for peace. Behind the scenes, exhaustion crept in. He smiled for cameras, laughed for interviews, but each night the silence grew heavier. He was haunted by the same ghosts that had followed him from childhood: the fear of failure, the hunger for love, the temptation of escape. The very fire that made him brilliant began to burn too hot. Fame gave him everything, and quietly, it began to take everything back. Because no matter how loud the applause, it could never drown out the whisper inside him, the one that asked, "Who are you when the music stops?" The world saw perfection, the golden couple, the hitmaker, the man who made love sound easy. But behind the shine, Keith Urban was fighting a silent war. Success had filled the rooms around him, but it had emptied something inside. The noise that once drowned his pain began to fade, and when the music quieted, the voices from his past came roaring back. He had spent his whole life running from fear, from silence, from the ghost of his father's rage. And now, when there was nowhere left to run, he reached for the one thing that had always promised to make it stop: the bottle. Addiction didn't arrive like an intruder. It came like an old friend, familiar and deceitful, whispering that it could help him breathe again. Nights blurred, days vanished. The man who had conquered the world was now losing battles within himself. Tour schedules were missed, shows canceled, promises broken. He would wake up in strange rooms, staring at his reflection, a face he no longer recognized. And yet, even in that darkness, one light refused to fade. Her name was Nicole. They had met at a Hollywood gala, two stars orbiting in different galaxies until their paths collided. For her, he was not the superstar. He was the quiet man with sad eyes. For him, she was not the actress. She was the peace he had never known. But love is not always enough to silence the noise. Only months after their wedding, Keith relapsed. The demons he thought he had outrun came back with brutal precision. It wasn't just about alcohol anymore. It was about shame, about the fear that he would lose the only person who ever saw the real him. Nicole didn't walk away. She fought for him. She called his friends, his managers, his bandmates, anyone who could help bring him back. And when he resisted, she staged an intervention with trembling grace. In the quiet of their home, she looked into his eyes and said the words that would save his life. "You can keep drinking, or you can come back to us." He chose her. He checked into rehab, broken but not defeated. There were days he wanted to leave, nights he almost did. But each time he picked up the guitar in that sterile room, he remembered what music once meant: not fame, not applause, but survival. Recovery was brutal, but it was real. It stripped away everything fake until only truth remained. Years later, he would say, "That was the moment I finally started living." And in that single sentence lies the heart of his tragedy and his redemption. Because Keith Urban didn't just survive fame, he survived himself. When the storm finally passed, what remained was quiet, and in that quiet, Keith Urban found himself again. He no longer chased the roar of the crowd. He began to seek something rarer, something truer: peace. The man who once lived on airplanes and stages now woke to the sound of laughter, not from fans, but from two little girls running through the kitchen. Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret became the melody that replaced the chaos. Nicole, steadfast and luminous, was the harmony that held it all together. Their home wasn't built of glamour. It was built of gentleness: morning walks through the fields of their farm in Australia, simple dinners without cameras, and quiet nights filled with stories instead of headlines. Keith still played, but differently. The music no longer came from pain, it came from gratitude. He said once in an interview, "I used to write to escape. Now I write to remember how far I've come." His songs became softer, wiser, tinged with reflection rather than regret. He kept touring, but never let it consume him again. On stage, he smiled not to perform, but because he meant it. Between shows, he painted, cooked, meditated things the old Keith would have called impossible. Sobriety wasn't just his promise to himself. It was a prayer he lived every day. He and Nicole built a life across continents: their home in Nashville, surrounded by trees, another in Sydney overlooking the harbor, and a farmhouse in Sutton Forest that still smells of rain and eucalyptus. There, away from the noise, he found what he had spent a lifetime searching for: belonging. His fans still see a star, but those close to him see something greater: a man who has finally learned the art of stillness. He once said, "Peace doesn't mean there's no fire left. It just means I know how to control the flames." And more guy, and about, said peace self, in more I, and that is perhaps Keith Urban's greatest song, one written not with instruments, but with grace. Keith Urban's story is not just about fame. It's about the human condition, about how pain, when faced with courage, can become art. In a world that often worships perfection, he became a reminder that beauty lives in imperfection, that even a broken voice can move mountains when it's honest. He changed what country music could be. Before him, the genre was rooted in the South, proud, traditional, but fenced by its own history. Keith tore down those fences. He blended Nashville twang with rock's edge, pop's emotion, and a vulnerability rare in any genre. He made country global, but he did it without losing its soul. You could hear it in his solos, that electric, almost spiritual fire that made people feel something more than melody. He once said, "I never wanted to be the best. I just wanted to feel real." And in that pursuit of authenticity, he became timeless. His music became more than entertainment. It became a language for healing. For fans struggling with addiction, his story offered hope. For dreamers far from home, his journey proved that the map to success doesn't start with privilege. It starts with persistence. And for those who have loved and lost, his lyrics whispered a truth, that redemption is always possible, even for the ones who burn. Today, Keith Urban stands not just as an artist, but as an archetype. The proof that resilience can coexist with tenderness, that masculinity can embrace emotion without shame. He made vulnerability powerful and honesty fashionable. Decades from now, when people look back on his music, they may not remember every award, every chart position, or every headline, but they will remember how he made them feel, that haunting mix of joy and ache, that quiet strength beneath every chord. Because legends aren't remembered for being flawless. They're remembered for surviving the fall and singing through the smoke. Fame has a way of distorting truth. It shows the shine, never the scars. And yet, Keith Urban's story reminds us that greatness is not the absence of pain, it is what we build from it. He was never the wild rock star tabloids tried to frame, nor the perfect husband magazines adored. He was both and neither, a man of contradictions, disciplined yet reckless, gentle yet stormy, fragile yet unbreakable. He stood on the world's biggest stages, but his most important performance was the one no one saw: the quiet act of staying alive, of choosing recovery over ruin, love over loneliness. It's easy to romanticize artists who suffer, to say their pain fuels their genius. But what Keith teaches us is different. Pain doesn't make the art, healing does. The world doesn't need more tortured souls. It needs survivors who learn to turn suffering into songs of hope. In a culture obsessed with comebacks and breakdowns, his journey is not just inspiring, it's instructive. Because Keith Urban didn't find happiness in success. He found it in surrender, in accepting that peace was never outside but within. He reminds us that you can rebuild your life, note by note, even after the music stops. And maybe that's what makes his story so haunting, not the tragedy, but the grace that followed it. Because when the fire burned everything down, Keith Urban didn't run from the ashes. He learned to rise from them. Time has a way of softening everything, even fire. The storms that once tore through his life have quieted into gentle rain. The boy from New Zealand who lost his home to flames has built one of his own, not from bricks or fame, but from forgiveness. There's a photo of him barefoot, sitting on his porch, guitar on his lap, his daughters laughing in the background. No stage, no lights, just a man and the sound of peace. And in that stillness, you can almost hear the echoes of everything he's endured. The pain, the love, the second chances, all blending into one long, endless song. Maybe that's what Keith Urban's life really is, not a tragedy, but a symphony of survival. Because somewhere between the ashes of his past and the serenity of his present, he found the rarest music of all, silence that doesn't hurt. And when you listen closely to his songs today, you can still hear it. The whisper of a man who refused to break, who burned, who bled, and who finally learned to sing, not for fame, but for freedom. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,